Hello, everyone, and welcome to NCSL's webinar, Moving to All-Mail Elections, Promises and Challenges. My name is Wendy Underhill, and I will be moderating this 60-minute webinar today. I'm the Director of the Elections and Redistricting team here at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And before I go any further, I need to fess up that I wrote the title for this session, and I wish I had been more careful. We aren't really talking about all mail elections. It's more like mostly mail elections, because states that mail ballots to all voters still have some amount of in-person voting going on. So think of this as the promises and challenges of mostly mail elections. Moving on behind the scenes today, I'm supported by Brian Hinkle and the rest of our team. Please know that our number one responsibility at NCSL is to provide legislators and legislative staff with information and analysis on elections, campaign finance, and redistricting. So ask us anything at elections-info@ncsl.org. And if you have a question that isn't on those topics, send it along too, and we'll make sure it gets to the right subject area expert. The plan for today has three parts. First, Representative Jonathan Christ-Tompkins from Alaska will provide his perspective as a lawmaker who is thinking of moving his state toward mostly mail voting. Yesterday, he held a hearing on this topic in front of the House State Affairs Committee, and I was fortunate enough to be invited to testify. I mentioned that in case any of the others of you on the webinar are thinking about this topic. If so, we can provide resources or testimony. Just ask. Second, we'll hear from Charles Stewart from MIT's Election Science and Data Lab. Many of you have probably met Charles at NCSL events in the past, back in the days when we could have in-person meetings. We look forward to that again. He'll give us a realistic view of how moving towards more mail voting works through an analytical lens. And then we'll hear from Jacqueline De Leon from the Native American Rights Fund, which is headquartered not far from my house here in Colorado. We hope to learn from Jacqueline how mail voting can negatively impact voting in Indian country and what states can do to ensure that participation in democracy is not compromised when making this shift. Now we have a few practicalities. Above the presentation itself, you will see a couple tabs with one of them labeled Resources. Here you can find and download a PDF version of the PowerPoint as well as additional handouts. Another tab is labeled Speaker, where you will find the bios for today's speakers. You'll also find a chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, and I see that some of you are already using it. Do type in your questions there, or answer other people's questions, or make comments based on your own experiences. For instance, right now, you could put in that box how you voted most recently. Did you go to a polling place on Election Day? Did you vote early at an election office? Or did you fill out an absentee ballot at home and then mail it in or drop it off? Might be fun to see how people have been voting in the past, and we'll see if this group that are on the line today are similar to the nation as a whole when about a quarter of voters used a mail ballot the last time around. This webinar platform is optimized for use in Google Chrome. While other web browsers such as Firefox may work, we recommend anyone experiencing technical difficulties try signing in through Chrome instead. And if you continue to experience issues, please email registration@ncsl.org. Oh, good. I see some people writing in on how they voted. Thank you. We're going to tally those up. We plan to answer questions at the end of the presentations, and we hope you'll stay on the line afterward for a quick survey on what other topics you might like us to address in future webinars. In fact, if you already have those kinds of ideas, you could stick them in the chat box as well. And lastly, today's webinar is being recorded. The link to access the recording will be added to the webinar registration page within a day or two, so feel free to suggest that your colleagues or others can watch this webinar after the fact. And that is it for me. Are you ready, Representative Christ-Tompkins?
I am, yeah. Thank you, Wendy.
Okay, go for it. Thank you.
Great. As Wendy mentioned, I'm coming to you all from up in Alaska, Juneau, Alaska specifically. I'm from a small island community called Sitka. If any of you have had the pleasure of making it to Southeast Alaska, that's my legislative district. We actually just adjourned a session yesterday, dispensing of some CARES Act appropriation business, but I convened my committee, an Alaska State Affairs Committee, that has jurisdiction over elections, and as Wendy mentioned, this is a subject that is actively receiving consideration here in the state. A little bit of background. Alaska has been considering this subject for a while now. In 2015, under the purview of the previous gubernatorial administration in Alaska, an election policy work group was formed, which included a representative from the Alaska House and the Alaska Senate, I was the representative from the House that sat on that work group, representatives from the two major political parties and a lot of other stakeholders. And in effect, our election equipment was reaching the end of its useful life, which was really sort of forcing and prompting the question of what the future of Alaska elections looks like. Parallel to that, there's been a flurry of elections-related activity, including in 2016, the passage of a ballot initiative, an initiative that I was in my non-legislative private citizen capacity very much involved in and sort of helped get going, which related to automatic voter registration, but not just any AVR, but AVR related to permanent fund dividend registration. And for those not familiar, Alaska mails every man, woman, child, everybody with a pulse a check every year for being alive, in effect, for being a citizen, called the permanent fund dividend. And unsurprisingly, 98% of people register for free money when given the opportunity every year. And so we made that registration process the trigger for being automatically registered. So in terms of the broader election landscape, its passage in 2016, this initiative's passage by a 2-to-1 margin is sort of relevant. Further, the municipality of Anchorage really seriously looked at vote by mail and ultimately decided to pursue vote by mail in 2018. And this is particularly a relevant development in Alaska in that we are a small state, about the population, a little bit bigger than Vermont, a little bit smaller than North Dakota population-wise. But Anchorage is by relative standards, a megalopolis, just a giant urban cluster in a way that Burlington is not, or Fargo is not. It's just under half the state's population within municipal boundaries, which is about the ratio of population between New York City to New York State. So it's basically half of Alaska is Anchorage. And so in 2018, when Anchorage made the decision to switch over to vote by mail, in effect, just shy of half of all Alaskans were now sort of being exposed to and familiarized with vote by mail elections. And then last year in 2019, I introduced House Bill 150, which is briefly the subject of the hearing yesterday that Wendy joined us for, which would switch Alaska over to vote by mail. And as you can imagine, and as is the case in every state in the union, COVID is putting a new lens on this issue. And just a month or month and a half ago, the Alaska legislature passed a disaster declaration bill making sort of special accommodation in this year of pandemic for the administration of government. And one of those accommodations was giving the elections director in Alaska the prerogative and the authority to administer our elections by mail, the primary and or general elections by mail, if she so thought that were necessary to protect public health. So there may be a by mail election later this year as a one-off because of COVID, although it was recently announced just last week by the lieutenant governor who appoints the elections director, and an Alaska lieutenant governor is basically our secretary of state, that the primary election will not be administered by mail. In other words, that elective authority was not invoked, although the general election, that decision is still yet to be made. So just a little bit of context in terms of where Alaska stacks up in the 50 states in terms of our vote at home or vote by mail status. And it's worth noting that while we don't have permanent absentee, by mail absentee laws or protocols, we are a no excuses absentee ballot state. So the future is a bit uncertain. There's of course this question in Alaska about the general election, whether it will be administered by mail or not. The legal authority for it to be administered by mail now exists, as I just mentioned. Further, the election policy work group has been reconvened by the new administration, including Lieutenant Governor Meyer, who's the new Lieutenant Governor. And again, he sort of fills the role of Alaska's Secretary of State. Although the work group has not been active per se, which has been the impetus in part for me to introduce House Bill 150. And it was initially just a placeholder bill to sort of facilitate the conversation, sort of see where things went with the election policy work group. And especially with COVID, I think the conversation is likely to get much more serious, certainly through the course of this year, but I also expect in the coming years as well. It's certainly an issue I intend to pursue and be involved with over the coming year or two, including the next legislature. We've used the Colorado system as a model. We've heavily leaned on the expertise of the National Vote at Home Institute and Amber McReynolds. And in fact, she testified just yesterday in the legislature as well. And this slide just gives a sense of vote by mail in Anchorage, which again is really relevant for Alaska in terms of the sort of voter learning curve in terms of what it's like to experience a vote by mail election. So, even though only half of Alaska residents are in Anchorage, pretty much everybody knows somebody in Anchorage. So just the sort of word of mouth familiarity that this isn't some big, scary foreign thing has sort of permeated through the state. And it's worth noting, it's just sort of the high level takeaway on this slide, that administration of Anchorage elections by mail have been seamless and successful. And further turnout has increased by somewhere from a quarter to a third, which, at least from my perspective, is a hugely positive small d democratic outcome. And this slide describes what that system in Anchorage looks like exactly. I don't think anything particularly special, just really good, solid work and competent administration by the Anchorage municipal government. And this last slide is really, to some extent, relevant in that, there's, I think, unfortunately, an increasingly partisan lens on vote by mail, vote at home for what I think is more just sort of a meat and potatoes policy and sort of administration question. That in part has been prompted by comments by our president, of course. But in Alaska, it's mostly non-politicized. It was controversial in our disaster declaration bill that we allow the elections director the authority to administer elections by mail. And there were a number of legislators, both in the Senate and the House, who voted against that provision. Ultimately, there was a majority bipartisan vote to include it, but that was sort of the first proxy vote in the legislature on the subject. And Lieutenant Governor Meyer last week, in announcing his decision not to administer the elections by mail for the primary election, cited voter fraud as a concern. And so, that concern, that thought is out there and circulating. I think, at least speaking from my perspective, emerging research, including a research and study done by Stanford in April, has found that turnout increases with vote by mail, vote at home, but there's actually no partisan or sort of political effect in terms of tilting the playing field vis-a-vis that increased turnout from one party to the other. And the Stanford study looked at slow rollout of vote by mail on a county by county basis and sort of looking at elections before vote by mail and elections after, sort of a control group, experiment group juxtaposition, and found that there was no partisan benefit for either party, and it was basically a wash. And there was an article in the National Review I saw earlier that sort of presented a similar upshot. So we'll be grappling with these questions in the weeks, months, and years ahead in Alaska, but we're very much a state that's at a decision point in terms of what the future of our elections looks like.
Well, thank you very much, Representative. I appreciate your comments and that nice, clear explanation of what's going on in Alaska. I thought I'd give the results of our informal chat box poll, and I know it is not anywhere near complete because lots of people haven't said anything. But so far, we have 16 people who voted in person and 11 who voted by mail or absentee. Charles, with that, I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Wendy. And it's great being here today, although I will admit that I'm a big fan of going to NCSL events and seeing people and talking to them in the side. So, and I hope there will be a time in the future when that can happen. So, but until then, here we are. I've been invited, as Wendy said, to talk about a bit more analytically or from an analytical perspective, promises and pitfalls of all mail elections, taking a 30,000-foot view of things. And the first thing I'd say by way of introduction, and this underscores something that Wendy said at the very beginning, is that there's two ways to think about the topic of all mail elections or expanding vote by mail. And so I wanted to lead off with just a couple of definitions so that we can be clear about what I'm talking about in this presentation. So vote by mail or vote at home is a system by which the state or local election jurisdiction automatically sends a ballot to every voter, usually active voters only, on a voter registration list, and we just heard descriptions of that in Anchorage. And that's in contrast with expanded mail balloting or more voting by mail, which is the increased use of vote by mail provisions in the state law, either due to spontaneous voter behavior, which is what we're seeing a lot of in many of the primaries right now around the country, or encouragement from government officials, which we're also seeing, or a bit of both. And so, and later on in this presentation, I'll note that there are some ways in which actually this distinction is really, really important, especially when it comes to the question of who initiates the voting by mail, whether it's the application of the voter or is it the affirmative action of the government in sending out the ballot. But even so, as one increases the number of votes that are cast by mail, certainly a number of issues come into play. So at a broad level, let me just list the promises and pitfalls, then we can dive in a little bit deeper. The promises, generally, the promises of all vote by mail, down at the bottom of the slide, cost savings. There's some evidence, actually a lot of evidence that once one settles into an all vote by mail regime, it does cost less. There's a shifting of costs, of course, but overall, mail elections do tend to cost less. As is also previously mentioned, there is evidence of increased turnout, slight turnout in general elections, a little bit more in primaries, and a lot in low visibility local elections, such as millage, millage questions, annexations, et cetera. There are claims that voting by mail increases citizenship knowledge and engagement because people can sit around the table and talk about issues as they're investigating how to vote. The scholarly literature there is only emerging, and so I'll just mention that as a claimed benefit. And then one real benefit is that you do get much more accurate voter lists when you're mailing out ballots to all voters, and you're doing it all the time. In the midst of COVID-19, there are other promises that are, of course, related to preserving public health, preserving access to the ballot, and preserving turnout. When it comes to the pitfalls, at all times, there are concerns about leakage in the mail ballot pipeline, and I'll be more precise about that. Something called residual votes or mistakes that people make on ballots, and questions about the legitimacy of elections. And then in particularly right now, as states are perhaps thinking about going to all vote by mail in the midst of COVID-19, there are organizational issues, supply chain issues, workplace issues, both related to workers and space, and the current state of voter lists, which are likely to be relatively poor or not as good as one might want in an all-mail system. So let me just say a bit more about the promises and pitfalls. So first of all, just the promises in preserving public health. This is if you're looking at the slides, this is a picture of a polling place in Bed-Stuy, New York City, last year in the 2018, or 2 years ago in the 2018 election. And one can almost literally say that if this were voting in 2020, that this would almost be literally a petri dish of democracy and a petri dish of COVID-19. And so these are the types of pictures that we're trying to avoid in voting and in all other aspects of social life right now. But short of pictures like we see in Bed-Stuy, there are more normal issues of preserving public health in a kind of a more in a less crowded place. And we need to think about one of the issues as we envision public distancing, social distancing in polling places, is that we're likely to move from situations like this where we have a lot of people lined up to vote to, if we're going to have social distancing and keeping 6 feet apart, actually the closing down of the elimination of voting booths and other pieces of equipment in polling places, and so in order to preserve public health. And social distancing, of course, as people line up out the door, down the street, in order to vote. So if there's going to be, we're going to be doing things to preserve public health. De-densifying in-person polling places is an important thing to do, and certainly increasing mail balloting as much as possible is going to serve that end. There's also, related to this preserving access to the ballot is evidence, and I'm throwing up a couple of slides from the Pew Research Center about voters being uncomfortable visiting polling places right now. About 2/3 of voters in a March survey said that they were uncomfortable going to polling places, and while there was some variation by demographics and party, what was really striking is that there wasn't as much variation as you might imagine. Another thing to think about is in terms of preserving turnout, and one of the things that we're observing during this primary season is that in the states that have either facilitated the use of mail balloting in the primaries or those where voters just naturally on their own turn to the use of mail ballots, that those states have seen the largest turnout in the primaries this cycle compared to states that have made it difficult to vote by mail or don't normally vote by mail. And I should say that this occurs even when you control for things like the competition, level of competitiveness in the presidential primary. So it does look like we're seeing evidence from this spring in the primary season of increased vote by mail preserving turnout. And there are these other selling points. I've touched on them already about cost savings, particularly once you've implemented all vote by mail, and increasing turnout, increasing knowledge, and more accurate voter lists. And I'll come back to some of these issues in a bit, because some of these issues actually are two-edged swords. But to continue moving on, let's think about the pitfalls for a second. And these are the pitfalls I mentioned before. Some are particular to what a state might encounter if it were to roll out a massive increase in voting by mail at the current time. And even in more normal times, there are particular pitfalls that state legislators and others need to keep in mind as one considers expanding voting by mail. Now, to make the first big point I'm going to make, I want to step back just a bit and provide one little bit of context about voting by mail in the United States. And that bit of context is just to note that vote by mail or vote at home has been gradually implemented in the states that have it, or has been implemented from a high base. So the graph that I'm showing right now is not focused on vote at home so much as just the different modes about how Americans have been casting votes over the past 20 years. And we see in this graph that at the turn of the century, about 90% of Americans were voting on Election Day in the traditional way. By 2016, 2018, that was down to 60%. In return, there's been a steady growth in voting by mail and a kind of a jagged but nonetheless relatively steady growth of in-person early voting. So that in 2016, roughly it was 60% on Election Day and then 20% by mail and in-person early. Now this is the national trend, but this isn't uniform across all of the states. And so I'm going to show a series of slides now that I know Wendy loves and other people like when I show them. It takes a little bit of explanation to begin, but it will make the point once we get going. This is a triangular plot, sometimes called a triplot. Some of y'all have encountered this in your days in taking geology or chemistry. And the way to read this graph is that states at the very top of the triangle are states in which if you're at the very top of the triangle, all of your voters are voting on Election Day. If the state is at the bottom corner where it says mail, then all of your voters are voting by mail. And then if the state is over on the right where it says early, all of your voters are voting early. So this graph to start shows in 1996 almost all of the states were at the very top of the triangle, meaning that most states people were voting on Election Day. And if there were deviations, say absentee voting, et cetera, it was in the mail direction. There were a couple of states, Tennessee and Texas, that were beginning to pioneer early voting, but mostly it was still voting in person on Election Day. Now, if we basically start running this graph forward, we see kind of a snow globe effect until we get to 2016. In 2016, as all the states have fallen from the very top, or most of the states have fallen from the very top, we see a variety of states in a variety of places. We still see about a dozen states at the very, very top, but we see a lot of states that have moved down to the left. Oregon and Washington down at the apex, Colorado very close, California, Montana, Arizona, Utah. Down there we see another set of states that have gone to early voting. We see a whole bunch of states kind of in the middle of the graph. I see Alaska there kind of in the middle of the clump, where states are doing kind of a bit of everything. Some early in person, some by mail, some on Election Day. So there's a wide variety of practices in the states, and one of the things to think about as one envisions moving to greater vote by mail is that states are starting from different places. For California to go to an all vote by mail system, which they're actually going to do for this presidential election, that's going to be a lower lift than if Oklahoma were to do it, or Arizona. Or Arkansas or Georgia, not to mention a Virginia or a Kentucky. So these are going to be very different experiences in the different states, and that's largely driven by the mail ballot regime. So this is a map. I've taken the data from the NCSL. I apologize. I actually rather like their map, but I'm using my map, and which shows the different mail ballot regimes in 2020. Ranging from still requiring excuses, which are the blue states, to the gold states, which are the ones that will be mailing ballots to voters in 2020. One of the things just to keep in mind from this is that 76% of the electorate right now in 2020 is in a state where you have to request a ballot in order to vote by mail. And it's also the case that all that growth that you saw in the earlier line chart in vote by mail is largely been driven over the last 20 years by these 6 states that are now going to be vote by mail in 2020. The rest of the states have not grown nearly as much. So back to the point I was making originally with this larger point, that the states that are currently vote by mail have gotten there from either gradually going there, or from a high baseline. We start with Oregon, which adopted first. We saw this is kind of not a very good one to show because the data don't begin well before Oregon's acquisition of vote by mail. But Washington makes the point better, is that Washington, over a series of years, indeed decades, increased its use of vote by mail until it finally went in whole hog. Similarly, this is actually mislabeled. It's actually Colorado. Steadily went in an all vote by mail direction. Utah, which will be going vote by mail this year, has been going in that direction for the last decade. Hawaii, which will be vote by mail this time, has been going that direction for the last several years. Likewise for California. And so the states that are all vote by mail right now have been going that direction steadily. If we look at all the rest of the states that are not vote by mail, this is what their trajectory looks like over the last 2 decades, and we can see it's roughly flat. And what we don't imagine is going to happen is something like this, where in 2020 it goes up to 100%. Because if it did, then we would get a train wreck of all sorts of administrative problems that would emerge. Now, so this gets back to, I guess the larger point I'm making here is that most states, in fact, all of the states that have adopted a complete vote by mail model, or one that imagines that a very high percentage, 60, 70, 80% will be voting by mail, have gotten there gradually and have adapted their practices gradually over time to the new realities, the qualitatively different realities of voting by mail, rather than just using absentee balloting as an adjunct to in-person voting. And as one thinks about expanding vote by mail, there are a number of processes that need to be revisited to handle the complexities that arise under vote by mail and the quantity of work under vote by mail. The slide that I'm showing has a lot of detail here, and I'm not going to go into the detail other than to say that with respect to procurement and staffing and procedures, as a state considers going to vote by mail, there's a lot of things to consider. But if one is especially considering going to almost all vote by mail, then there's a set of procedures that are bolded in this graph that one needs to consider. And one of the ones that I would underscore is the cleaning of voter address lists. And this is a point I made right at the beginning. And that is, it's one thing to be mailing a ballot to somebody who has requested it and put their mailing address on the application. It's quite another thing just to mail ballots to everybody on the voter list, because what one discovers that when one mails to just people on the voter list is that there are a lot of people who have moved and there's a lot of bad addresses. And that becomes a problem if you're mailing ballots rather than something like applications for absentee ballots. So that's something that needs to be considered. But there's other things that have to be talked about too when you're voting by mail in bulk, such as ways of automating the verification of signatures and the like. So big administrative challenges to going to all vote by mail. But there's also problems of what I call leakage in the pipeline. And the idea here is that in order to vote by mail, there's a number of steps that one takes where, if you're a voter trying to vote by mail, it's possible that your efforts will be thwarted. And the number of opportunities for your efforts to vote to being thwarted are much greater in voting by mail than voting in person. And the reason for that is that to vote by mail in most states, especially when you have an application, you have a kind of a mail circuit in order to get the application and get the ballot, and then you have another circuit of hurdles, to mix metaphors, to actually get that ballot back to the election department. And so in every place along the way, it's possible that essentially, the vote or the ballot kind of gets metaphorically lost. It doesn't necessarily get literally lost, but it gets metaphorically lost. Now, if one goes to total vote by mail and just mails a ballot to everybody, we get rid of a couple of these opportunities, especially the leakage because of the request. But nonetheless, many more opportunities for leakage remain. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. Another pitfall is something called residual votes. And just very, very quickly, a residual vote is defined as an over or an undervote for an office in the ballot. And there's two reasons why you can have a blank or an overvote. One can be abstention, and the other can be voter error. Changes to election law because of HAVA have reduced residual votes over the last 20 years because the requirement that scanners at least kick back undervoted ballots under most circumstances, or that you get warnings on DRE screens and ballot marking device screens that there's something wrong with the ballot. But when you vote by mail, you don't get those warnings. And so if a voter has made a mistake, then there is no fail-safe there. And the research that I've done with colleagues at Caltech have shown, using data from California over a couple of decades, that there is a residual vote penalty via mail balloting, at least in California, that ranges from 2 percentage points in the votes for president to up to 5 percentage points in the vote for senator. Finally, there's issues of electoral legitimacy that I'll actually, for the interest of time, not say a whole lot about, other than just to note that while there is widespread support for vote by mail and vote by mail states, there is not a whole lot of support for vote by mail and not vote by mail states. And this is even true as people recognize that they might vote by mail in 2020 because of an emergency circumstance, but consideration of voting by mail in a non-emergency circumstance was likely to be different. And let me just say a few words about fraud, which is going to be, I'm going to end with, and is no doubt the most controversial part here, but let me just say a couple of things very quickly. In expanding vote by mail, the issue of fraud always comes up. And, in a balanced view of here, the bad news is that there are more temptations. I think we just have to recognize that for fraud in the mail mode than in the in-person mode. And that although it's rare, mail ballot fraud is rare, absentee ballot fraud is still less rare than in-person fraud. Actually, I should have started with the good news, which was to make the point that absentee ballot fraud was in fact rare, and that people in actually voted home states believe it's as rare as people in non-voted home states. And so the experience of people in voted home states is not a whole bunch of fraud going on. But I would end here the discussion of fraud in my words by making what I call sideways comments about the fraud issue, and that my observation of just the debate about voter fraud has led me to believe that some of the debate is certainly about values, but also just about different ways of thinking about identical issues. And for instance, a couple of the issues that come up with fraud having to do with, say, untoward ballot family influence or ballot harvesting, sometimes called ballot collection. It could be one person's fraud, it could be another person's feature or good thing. So the idea of a family sitting around, a husband and a wife sitting around a table talking about the candidates and marking their ballots, sometimes is seen as being a good thing, but also could be an opportunity for untoward influence over members of the family. So, there's kind of two sides to some of the discussions about voter fraud. And then the second thing I'd say is that attention to security measures certainly becomes more important as the number of mail ballots increases. And so, there does need to be increased attention to signature matching, tracking of ballots, and then the regulation of ballot return. As you get more ballots by mail, what might be a kind of a small inconvenience or a small hiccups, when maybe only 5% of the ballots are cast by mail, can become actually major and determinative in the outcome when all the ballots are cast by mail. So with those words, I thank you for your time, and again, thanks to Wendy and CSL for giving me this opportunity to address y'all.
Well, thank you, Charles. I think the thanks go your way. That was a really great summation for us. You packed very much information into very few minutes, so thank you. Jacqueline, are you lined up, ready to go?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, go for it.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Jacqueline DeLeon, a staff attorney with the Native American Rights Fund. And I'm here, I think my role is a little bit of the cold water role. And that's just to say that my big takeaways that I hope everybody gets is that we think increased vote by mail is great, but we think all vote by mail is not great. And that we still must provide safe in-person voting options, especially in rural and high poverty areas. And rural and high poverty areas correlate, unfortunately, very often with tribal reservations. And so the reason is, from our perspective, from Native Americans' perspective, is that vote by mail is not a panacea. So a couple of examples is that lower income and minority groups tend to move more often and suffer from increased homelessness and so have trouble receiving a ballot. There's no convenient election day registration, and some persons with disabilities need touch screens and audio ballots. I'd also say language assistance is an issue if you're moving to an all vote by mail system. So we're going to look a little bit closer into Native Americans and why, a deep dive into why they're disenfranchised by vote by mail. So over the last 3 years, NARF and the Native American Voting Rights Coalition conducted a series of 9 field hearings across Indian country, asking the question why it is that Native Americans aren't voting on par with the rest of the country. And coming from that inside look, a lot of the barriers that were preventing access became highlighted. And what also became clear is that a transition to a vote by mail system wouldn't be feasible. So I think the biggest sort of case closed kind argument, at least, or especially in light of COVID and the idea that vote by mail is going to provide a safer voting option, is the fact that Native Americans do not receive mail at their homes, right? So this is because they live in rural areas. The homes themselves may not be marked, or they have a non-traditional address. So that's something other than 123 Main Street. And the post office does not deliver to these homes. And so as a consequence, countless Native Americans aren't going to be receiving that ballot at the home. And so if they don't receive the ballot at the home, they're not going to be able to vote safely from home. I'll also say that in states where the option for not receiving a ballot at your home is the county seat, where that's the nearest elections office, throughout Indian country, county seats are absurdly far away from Native populations. So, for example, from the Duckwater Reservation, the county seat is an astounding 140 miles away. So it's not sort of a feasible solution to say, just travel to your county seat and pick up your ballot on election day if you can't get a ballot at your home. So it's not just the fact that the homes themselves are unmarked or not receiving mail. Even for homes that are receiving mail, housing in Indian country is, I think, somewhat unimaginably bad. So there's a severe housing crisis. So I'm saying it's not uncommon to have 15 people sharing a home, and couch surfing is incredibly common. To really drive that point home, in 2017, for the 11,000 members of the Northern Arapaho tribe in Wyoming, there were just 230 reservation homes. That's an average of nearly 48 people per home. And 55% of the tribal members were considered homeless because they were couch surfing. And, in Navajo Nation, if people weren't couch surfing, that's between 42,000 and 85,000 people who would be homeless. So these kind of housing issues are incredibly real in Indian country. I think sort of out of step of the average American's everyday life. But this is a sizable population that cannot feasibly pick up a ballot or receive a ballot at their home. And if they're moving from home to home, they're not going to have a stable address where they can also receive that ballot. I'd also say that rural post office don't substitute for at-home vote by mail, right? And that's because I think, so I think the next logical step after, if you're not going to receive your ballot at home, why don't you go ahead and, you're probably going to receive it through a P.O. box, right? Why don't we just send the ballot to the P.O. box? Well, P.O. boxes are 20 to 50 miles away. The picture of the rural post office on the slide is from Montana. That rural post office, when I made the slide on Tuesday, was open from 8 a.m. to noon, which means that it's, obviously very limited hours. P.O. boxes require a fee. They're limited in number. In Indian country, because of the fee, because of the distance, and because of the limited number, multiple people, 10 plus, are sharing a P.O. box. And the way it works is somebody just does a mail run. They pick up all of the mail and they go back and they say, hey, will you take this mail to your sister? I picked it up from the P.O. box, and that mail gets transferred to a relative or to a known friend that then gets dropped off to somebody else. This is not, obviously, clearly not a perfect system. It means that mail is lost. It means that there's long lapses between picking up and receiving mail. Conceivably, people would miss an entire election cycle before they receive their mail. I'll also, before I had made this, there's also sort of issues. For example, in Alaska, recently Raven Air is no longer delivering rural mail. And so there's a question as to how these people are going to receive mail at all. So there's real issues in the chain of mail delivery in Indian country. Also, these security, when it comes from a rural mailbox, there's going to be a really circuitous route that mail takes. For example, when voters in Navajo return their ballot, instead of going straight to Coconino County elections officials, which may not be, which only might be 20 or 30 miles away, the mail gets routed all the way to Flagstaff and then to Phoenix and then back to Coconino County. As a consequence, it's going to take a really long time to travel. And it's also unclear how long of a time mail would take to be delivered. And so if, for example, you're not using same day or election day postmarks as to be considered timely for your mail delivery, Native Americans who vote a week before, 2 weeks before, may not have their ballots reach their county recorder in time. This problem isn't just a Native American problem. There are non-traditional addresses throughout the United States, typically in rural areas. So anybody that has general delivery, rural route and box numbers, highway contract route and box numbers, and post office box only delivery, conceivably is going to encounter some of these problems. So it's not just an Indian country issue. Some of the solutions, we think that ultimately, given the fact that Native Americans are going to have an in-person interaction anyway, probably 2 to pick up and drop off their ballot, it's better to maintain in-person voting options. Of course, in light of the virus, we think that these options should be as safe as possible, especially due to, like we're seeing, the vulnerabilities in Native American populations. I think the Navajo Nation now has the highest infection rate in the country. And so, I think Native Americans are in a really tough position in this upcoming election. But what we need is a cooperation with state and county officials to work with tribes to provide safe options. So, ample early voting options to minimize crowds, curbside voting, I think, is a novel and good idea to minimize interactions. Funding for PPE, set aside times for vulnerable and elder populations, and then offer language assistance in these in-person voting options. And also use tribal officials as elections officials and tribal community members as poll workers to limit outside germs. Native Americans are American citizens and qualified to be elections officials and poll workers, and often people, I think, for some reason don't make that connection and think that you have to import outside poll workers onto a reservation. It's not true, or communities that service Native Americans. We also think that working with Native American communities to have on-site polls would be especially helpful. There are also novel solutions. So, for example, Washington, which is an all-vote-by-mail state, recently passed a Native American Voting Rights Act, and that's because they are trying to address this problem of unaddressed homes and homelessness on the reservation. And what they did is that they allowed for tribes to designate a building on the reservation, usually like a tribal administration building. That building can be used to register, so it's pretty critical. That address, the tribal building itself, is the address that's used to register. It's also where the ballot is sent and where it's picked up and dropped off by the tribal member. And so that saves the individual who doesn't have a home where mail can be delivered, or who's moving from home to home and doesn't have a consistent address. They now can use that tribally designated building as an address, and they can also use that tribally designated building, which is probably closer than post offices, to pick up and drop off their ballot. And we think that's a good solution for anybody that's moving to an all vote by mail versus an increased vote by mail. And I'm happy to work with anybody that's interested in making those sorts of transitions. So that's all for me, and I appreciate the opportunity to throw a little cold water on all vote by mail enthusiasts.
Well, thank you very much. It didn't feel like all that much cold water, given that you had some solutions in there as well. And I appreciate you bringing to our attention what are some of the tricky points of voting in Indian country. I see that we have Senator Sam Hunt from Washington here, and I think we've got the link to the Washington's Native American Voting Rights Act in the chat box. Okay, we've got a couple of things to do, and then we're going to get to questions. I do want to let you know that this is the third of a 4-event series. The next one will be next week, same time. We're going to do it by Zoom. We're going to have Secretary Kim Wyman from Washington with us, so we can hear more about Washington's model if we'd like to, and a couple of other experts. So do join us. The way I'm picturing that is it's more of a Q&A. Just let's have the questions coming, and it'll be directly on Zoom. You'll ask your own questions. So I hope that works out for you. And now we'll do the questions. The first one I'm going to ask is for you, Jacqueline, and we did have an answer in the box, but let's see what you've got to say. How far on average do people living on reservations have to travel to vote in person?
Yeah, thank you for that. So absurdly far, really. Sometimes we've heard 40 miles, sometimes we've heard 60 miles. 20 to 40 miles, I'd say, would be the average. But I'd also note that those are usually on unpaved roads, which can be especially difficult to navigate in November.
Great. That's the same answer, more or less, as we got in the chat box as well. And another one for you. Aren't there also language issues needing translation because native languages such as Navajo don't have words for, say, the ballot?
Absolutely. So that's another reason that we think in-person is important. And some native languages are entirely unwritten. So that doesn't really provide much of an opportunity for a mail ballot.
Great. And then a question from Norman Lee, and I'm going to throw this one to you, Charles. What steps can be taken to mitigate the risk of third-party influence on how a voter fills out his or her ballot, especially at nursing homes and adult care facilities? You sort of addressed this in the home situation.
Yes. That is a tricky situation, and it's one that comes up constantly. I have to say I have to punt a bit on. I'll have to punt a bit on that because it seems to me that this is one of the areas where you could say that if someone were intent upon everything from coercing, which looks to be rare, to kind of guiding someone to vote in a particular way, without observation of what's going on by a neutral third party. I mean, there are temptations there. The obvious solution that comes immediately to mind is to have the voting assistance, especially if it comes from non-family caregivers, to be done in the open or in the presence of somebody else. And so, if, to the degree possible, not have it happen in someone's room, especially in a care facility. Of course, that itself can be, can be difficult given the circumstances of a lot of care facilities. So I mean, you've touched on what is I think one of the toughest issues in male elections, and there ultimately we rely on the goodwill of people, and and felony laws and other election laws that can address cases where this happens in large numbers, where the reports could get out. But on just kind of one-on-one, one-off sorts of things, I mean, this is a really difficult nut to crack.
Got it. And now a question for you, Representative. This comes from Doug Robinson, and you may not have the answer to it. Maybe none of us really do. Is there any research or evidence that foreign disinformation campaigns have more or less influence on vote-by-mail voters than on other voters?
Oh, fascinating question. I have no particular insight there, although my, from the hip thinking, I'm sure, no more insightful than anyone else's, as I can't imagine why it would be any different. But yeah, unfortunately, no special insight on that question.
Great. Okay. And it could be that you've got something, Charles, on that, but let me give you the next three sort of as a package. Aaron asks about the small increase in voter fraud reported is in a mostly vote-by-mail system, a scale factor. Is that scale factor or otherwise? It's possible you've already dealt with that. And the second one from Anna is about voter fraud is typically not fraud. It's mostly, maybe this is a comment more than a question. Ballots are cast by dead people are typically people who died after they sent in their ballots. And then, so if you could talk a little bit more about that. And then particularly touch on the vote harvesting issue. You did discuss ballot collection a little bit, but if you could just do a tiny bit more, and then we're going to have to wrap up shop here.
Okay, so on scale, really quickly. I mean, if you look at I mean, there are lists, for instance, of prosecutions for vote fraud, voting by mail. And I recently wrote an op-ed with Amber McReynolds about this, and I've forgotten the actual number, but it's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percentage. If you take the number of prosecuted mail vote fraud cases and divide it by the number of mail votes cast over, say, over the last 20 years, and so so even if everybody is voting by mail, what would be prosecuted in a particular state would still, be in the, in the onesies and the twosies in most states. So not a whole lot. I mean, the part about dead people, I think I would kind of go a little both forward and back from that one. I mean, a lot of the cases of voter fraud that you see are these kind of heart-rending cases. Not somebody who just kind of died while the ballot was in transit, but oftentimes, it's the widow whose departed husband, died, a month before, and she knows exactly how he would have voted, and sees his continuing his legacy. And so, so that's the sort of thing we see, which is, not organized deception, but people, just kind of good-hearted people who just do foolish things, and they get caught up in prosecution for fraud. And then finally, vote harvesting. That's a big issue. And when I've talked to people from states like Colorado that have a lot of voting by mail, they point this out, that if you make it easy to return the ballot, that is, that you don't have notarization requirements, and if you put postage on the return envelope, then the incentives for ballot collection actually go way down. One of the reasons why you have incentives for ballot collection is that in some states it's relatively difficult to return the ballot. And so, quote-unquote, friendly people will come around and offer to provide the notary, or provide the stamp, or to get the ballot back. And so if you reduce those barriers to returning the ballot, you actually can deal with the ballot harvesting. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing is that, I am somebody who is concerned about ballot collections, especially in bulk, but you can regulate that. You can require people returning ballots, for instance, to identify themselves on the outside of the envelope, so that one can investigate cases where there appear to be a lot of ballots being returned in particular patterns by particular individuals. And so, there are ways of regulating this without outlawing it outright. Although, of course, some states actually do that.
Thank you. And I do want to come to Jacqueline, but I first need to say thank you to Representative Chris Tompkins. He's got to be somewhere else 3 minutes ago. And Charles, I think you two also have to jump off. If you do, thank you very much for spending this hour with us. And now, Jacqueline, would you address ballot collection in Indian country? It might have a different flavor there than it does elsewhere.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so really quickly, I'll just say that ballot collection in Indian country is absolutely vital, and for the reasons that Chris mentioned, and that it's unreasonably difficult to return the ballot. So, given the distances that people have to travel to drop off a ballot, it's simply impossible for people with limited transportation to make that return. And so people go around and collect ballots. And I will say, when we were on this call, I just got an email that let us know that a temporary restraining order was granted in Montana against their ballot collection ban there, for the very reasons that I'm expressing, that it's just unreasonably hard for Native Americans to return their ballot without ballot collection. So we think that there are other ways to regulate.
Right. I'm noticing that ballot harvesting could be a different thing than ballot collection. It sort of depends on your lens on that. Mark Sternman had a question. He asked, are the vote-by-mail high turnout states also states that had high turnout pre-vote-by-mail? I can answer that a little bit. Oregon and Washington have tended to have high turnout, and Colorado has as well. Colorado did see an increase after it went to the all-mail model, but I think we could attribute that to either changing the model or to having some hot races on the ballot. Hawaii is a low turnout state, and and so is Utah for that matter, and those states, at least in Hawaii, I can say for sure that part of the reason they wanted to go that way was to increase turnout. And with that, I'm going to say thank you to you, Jacqueline, as well as to our other presenters, and I'm going to thank everybody for being on the line with us for this. I'm so glad that you were able to join us today. Do stay on, give us some ideas about what we could do in the future, and please stay safe and stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you.